The administration has used that declaration as a pretext to impose sweeping tariffs on a friend, on a neighbor, on an ally, which are taxes paid by American consumers and businesses on Canadian imports.
In Washington, something unusual is happening. A U.S. senator is standing up not against a foreign rival, but against her own president, and for Canada. That's the story unfolding this week as Senator Amy Klobuchar, joined by both Democrats and Republicans, takes the floor of the U.S. Senate to demand an end to President Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods. At a time when the White House keeps declaring economic victory, the reality looks far different. The tariffs that were supposed to protect America's economy are now dividing its own leaders. Even inside Congress, voices are rising to say what many Americans already feel, that this trade war has gone too far and that its victims are not in Ottawa, but at home. When even Washington senators start echoing the same frustration Canadians have been expressing for months, you know something fundamental has shifted. The resolution introduced by Senator Klobuchar wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a bipartisan act, backed by Senators Tim Kaine, Rand Paul, Mark Warner, and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, aimed at formally ending the national emergency Trump invoked to justify tariffs on Canada. Their message is simple: the so-called emergency doesn't exist. There's no security threat at the northern border, no crisis in cross-border trade, only a policy built on political impulse. In April 2025, the Senate had already voted once to terminate the same emergency declaration, but the administration refused to lift it. Instead, it doubled down, raising tariffs to 35% on August 1st, and then added another 10% in late October, this time, astonishingly, in response to a provincial ad campaign from Ontario that used Ronald Reagan's old speech criticizing protectionism. For many in Congress, this was the breaking point. What began as an argument over trade had turned into a test of constitutional power. Lawmakers from both parties began to agree that tariffs imposed by presidential mood swings were destabilizing not just the economy, but America's credibility. It's rare to see Rand Paul and Chuck Schumer agree on anything, yet this time they did, because no matter where they stand politically, they could see that punishing Canada, a historic ally, was punishing America itself. Behind the politics lies a straightforward economic truth. Every tariff is a tax, one that American consumers and businesses pay first. Since the new tariffs began in March 2025, the costs have rippled across U.S. households and industries. According to data cited in the Senate hearing, the average American family is paying nearly $2,000 more per year for everyday goods. Small businesses and tourism towns near the border are feeling it most, with fewer visitors and rising costs for supplies. Aluminum cans, lumber, and farm equipment, all dependent on cross-border supply chains, have become more expensive not because of shortages, but because of policy. Economically, it's a loop that feeds itself. When the U.S. taxes imports from Canada, it drives up domestic prices, reduces consumer spending, and hurts exports in return. The problem isn't abstract. It's visible in empty stores along border towns and the 20% drop in Canadian visitors this year reported by state tourism boards. So while the administration calls these tariffs America First, the reality looks more like America turning on itself. North of the border, the response has been measured. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who met recently with several U.S. senators in Ottawa, has avoided escalation. Instead, he keeps stressing dialogue and long-term stability. During those meetings, Carney reportedly told lawmakers that the U.S.-Canada relationship has become mostly transactional. For many Canadians, that single phrase captured the current era perfectly. It signaled that Canada is no longer willing to define its economic identity through Washington's choices. In fact, each new tariff from the White House has only strengthened the case for diversification. Canadian trade missions are multiplying across Asia, and public sentiment at home has shifted sharply towards supporting Buy Canadian initiatives. While American politics seem locked in a cycle of tariff announcements and Senate rebellions, Ottawa's tone is calm, consistent, and confident. It's not the noise of confrontation that defines leadership, but the discipline to outlast it. Back in Washington, the debate is no longer about whether tariffs are good or bad. It's about limits on power, on law, and on the president's ability to use emergency authority to change trade policy at will. The Senate resolution that Klobuchar and her colleagues pushed forward marks one of the few times in recent memory that Congress has united across party lines to check executive power. The courts, too, are weighing in. A federal trade court panel, composed of judges appointed by 3 different presidents, unanimously ruled that the administration's broad use of emergency powers to impose these tariffs was unlawful under the 1977 National Emergencies Act. Their decision underscored a simple principle: Congress controls the power to tax, not the White House. Economically, the message is just as significant. It reflects a growing recognition that the stability of North American trade, built over decades through the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, cannot survive under constant policy whiplash. When tariffs change 100 times in a single year, as trade groups testified, no company can plan investments or hiring. The revolt in Washington, then, isn't just political. It's a reminder that predictability is part of prosperity. Ironically, while America wrestles with its own divisions, Canada is experiencing a quiet surge in national confidence. The tariffs that were supposed to pressure Canada's economy have instead unified public opinion and accelerated industrial policy. Across provinces, industries are investing more at home and turning outward to new Asian markets. Even U.S. border towns are feeling it, with fewer Canadian visitors and struggling small shops. Tourism losses are now visible across several states. To many observers, it's a striking reversal. The tariffs intended to demonstrate strength have exposed weakness, a U.S. policy so erratic that its own senators, courts, and business groups are working to restrain it. Meanwhile, Canada's measured patience is earning global respect. In the end, this debate is no longer about tariffs or trade statistics. It's about how a nation governs itself under pressure. When senators from both parties rise in the same chamber to tell a president that he's gone too far, it marks a turning point. The same words that once united Americans against foreign competition are now being used to defend cooperation with one of their oldest allies. The lesson is simple. Economic nationalism sounds powerful in a speech, but fragile in practice. Tariffs can start as tools of leverage and end as symbols of isolation. For Canada, the turmoil south of the border is no longer a threat, it's validation. Every time Washington chooses confrontation over cooperation, Canada's case for independence grows stronger. Its leaders are choosing strategy over spectacle, stability over chaos, and long-term partnership over short-term politics. As history has shown, real strength isn't measured by how loudly a country shouts, but by how steadily it stands. And right now, Canada is standing tall, while America argues with itself.
We can't do so without acknowledging the elephant in the room. President Trump continues to take direct aim at Canada. Well, he's going to really go after us now. I'm reading my speech. I just called him an elephant. But anyways, can't call that guy any name.
In a crowded ballroom at Toronto's Empire Club, Ontario Premier Doug Ford paused, smiled, and mentioned the elephant in the room. The audience laughed, but the message was unmistakable. For months, President Trump's latest tariff wave had unsettled both sides of the border. Duties on steel, autos, aluminum, lumber, even critical minerals. Washington called it strength. Ottawa called it provocation. Ford turned a luncheon into a defining moment. He told business leaders that Ontario would not be pushed around by U.S. policy. The mood changed instantly. What began as a light remark became a signal that Canada was ready to fight back. Trump's 2025 tariff expansion touched nearly every industry that links the two economies. Steel and aluminum faced new surcharges. Auto parts, once exempt, were suddenly taxed. Furniture, copper, and heavy trucks joined the list. Even film and semiconductor manufacturing fell under Washington's widening national security umbrella. For Canada, the effect was immediate. Ontario alone exports more than $80 billion worth of manufactured goods to the United States each year. Every new duty squeezed margins and threatened factory jobs from Windsor to Hamilton. Ford's speech marked a turning point. He described these measures as a tax on a partner, not on a rival, and he acted before Ottawa could. Ontario introduced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, a signal that the province would no longer stay silent. At the same time, Queen's Park launched a $75 million Canadian dollar campaign built around Ronald Reagan's old warning against protectionism, running in both Canadian and U.S. markets. For Ford, it was as much about livelihoods as politics. Ontario's industrial belt depends on cross-border trade. His voters see the impact of every plant closure. Taking a stand wasn't symbolism, it was survival. Trump's plan sought to pull production back to America, but by October 2025, it was producing the opposite effect. Canadian manufacturers began investing in domestic supply chains. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce reported a 12% rise in new industrial permits during the third quarter, driven by steel finishing, auto components, and clean energy materials. Export Development Canada noted that more firms were seeking insurance and credit for European clients, reducing dependence on U.S. orders. Instead of weakening Canada, the tariffs pushed it toward greater self-reliance. In his address, Ford framed Ontario as capable of becoming one of the richest and most secure regions in the world if it harnessed its own talent and resources. Behind the optimism was calculation. By taxing electricity exports and promoting Made in Ontario, Ford leveraged the sectors where his province holds real power: energy, minerals, and advanced manufacturing. Analysts estimated Ontario's grid supplied roughly 6% of New York State's demand in 2024. Even a small surcharge reminded U.S. states how deeply their economies depend on Canadian energy. Meanwhile, data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics showed a 5-month decline in manufacturing employment through September 2025, with 78,000 fewer factory jobs than a year earlier. Ontario's policy response also had a psychological effect. Business confidence surveys by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business showed a steady climb through late 2025, reversing months of uncertainty. Companies that once delayed investment decisions began accelerating production to meet new domestic contracts, especially in transportation equipment and battery materials. The Ontario government set up a new task force connecting auto suppliers with provincial mining firms to ensure stable access to nickel, lithium, and copper, key components for EV manufacturing. These moves transformed the tariff shock into a catalyst for industrial planning. The shift may be modest in numbers today, but symbolically, it marked the rebirth of economic nationalism on Canadian terms. The irony was clear. A policy meant to protect American workers was beginning to erode their industries, exactly the kind of reversal Ford had warned about. The echo echoed far beyond Toronto. In Washington, officials were surprised not by Ottawa's diplomats, but by a provincial premier speaking directly to U.S. power. Regional leaders along the border quickly noticed. Governors from manufacturing states voiced concern about higher electricity prices and supply chain delays. Industry groups in the Great Lakes region called for clarity on tariffs, saying the back-and-forth measures were disrupting deliveries of parts and materials. Trump, accustomed to controlling every headline, suddenly faced a story he didn't script: a Canadian leader challenging his policy head-on. It underscored a shift among U.S. allies who have grown weary of uncertainty. In Europe, Japan, and South Korea, governments had already signed sectoral trade frameworks, setting tariff caps at 15%. Canada, bound by geography and supply chains, had less flexibility, until Ontario forced the issue. By standing firm, Ford reframed the conversation. Rather than pleading for relief, Canada was now seen as the steady player defending predictable rules in North American commerce. As the applause faded in the Empire Club ballroom, one thing was clear: the tone of Canada's relationship with Washington had changed. Ford's humor, his Reagan references, and his direct language toward Trump all served a purpose: to announce that Ontario would defend its economy on its own terms. The months ahead will test whether that strategy holds. The electricity surcharge, the advertising campaign, and the surge in local investment all signal a broader shift toward economic independence inside a volatile North American market. For the United States, the lesson is the same one history keeps repeating. Tariffs can buy leverage, but they can also breed isolation. When partners start protecting themselves instead of cooperating, the costs multiply on both sides of the border. What began as a push to reindustrialize America has instead encouraged Canada to do the same, not out of rivalry, but out of necessity. Ford's speech was more than a rebuttal. It was a turning point. Trump's tariff strategy aimed to reassert dominance. Instead, it awakened a new assertiveness in Canada, one that no longer fears the elephant in the room.